I recently read a quote that went something like this: "We should never think of ourselves based solely upon what our dogs think of us." Let that settle in for just a bit. How many of you have a dog or have had a dog in your lifetime? Most of you have had dogs. So I'll just tell you, when I read this quote, I thought about the best dog I ever had, whose name was Kiko. So we got Kiko when Kiko was just a little puppy. Kiko was a poi dog, a mutt, part Springer Spaniel, part Border Collie and part Australian Shepherd, a medium-sized dog that was just the cutest thing you had ever laid eyes on. Cutest thing I ever laid eyes on, okay. So anyway, Kiko was one of those dogs that was, in my mind, the perfect dog. Kiko was not only adorable, but Kiko lived to please me. Kiko thought I was the best thing that ever happened in the world. And, you know, as I was thinking back about Kiko, by the way, Kiko means spot in Hawaiian. He was all white with huge black spots all over his body and kind of a spaniel-type face. But I remember when I would walk in the room, Kiko would just be so excited that I was there. And you could tell, it was just so visible. Kiko thought, this is the best thing in the world. Alan's home. And then, if I were to say to Kiko his two favorite words, good boy, Kiko just died and went to heaven right there. I mean, Kiko just loved me and making me happy. Kiko is one of those dogs, actually, that was so trainable that on command, I could say, sit, lie down, heel, go to bed, stay on your bed. Kiko did everything I wanted. It was incredible. Well, as I was thinking about Kiko this week and that quote, it really made sense to me. If I thought about myself only based on what Kiko thought of me, what a big head I would have. How egotistical and arrogant I would be if I thought of myself only in that way. As I was thinking about that, however, I began thinking about how sometimes we think so little of ourselves. And maybe I should get a dog again. But, you know, the thing is, many, many times in our lives, the problem isn't that our heads are too big or we think too highly of ourselves. Many times we think so small. We forget that we are beautiful creatures created in the image of God, loved unconditionally by God. It's written all over the scriptures. And yet we act as if none of that is true. A couple of weeks ago, when I was reading quotes by Nelson Mandela celebrating his 100th birthday, I came across this one again. This is one that I may have mentioned a few years ago in church. It was in his inaugural speech in 1994, and I think it really hits home the potential, the ability to change the world if we truly thought of ourselves the way God thinks of us and we thought about everybody else in that same way. Listen to what Nelson Mandela said in his inaugural speech. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, and fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small doesn't serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We are all meant to shine, as children do. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It's not just in some of us. It's in everyone. And as we let our light shine, our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. as we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. I have come across this quote by Nelson Mandela many times, and I have never, ever once thought, what an egotistical man. What an arrogant person. I've always thought how wonderful that he was so grounded in his identity and understood how God thought of him and everybody else, that he was willing to firmly take a stand in that space and not budge from it, even after serving in prison 27 years. My friends, if you don't remember anything else today, remember this. What we think of ourselves determines everything else about our lives. Everything. In this morning's scripture passage that Angela just read to us in John chapter 6, Jesus was talking about bread. But really what he was talking about was identity. And he was talking about a way that the world saw, people in the world saw themselves, and the way God saw people, and the two ways were so different, diametrically opposed. According to the world, people were fearful beings living in a world of scarcity. But according to Jesus, people were actually children of God, living in a world of abundance where there is enough for everyone. Now, in order to understand this text in the scripture, it's important to look at the broader context. And so let's look at all of John chapter 6, first of all. We know at the beginning of the chapter that Jesus was feeding 5,000 people. Actually, it was probably at least 20 to 25,000 people, because in those days when you counted a crowd, you only counted the men. Don't know why, that's just the way it was. But the point was, there were many, many people. It was a huge, huge, huge crowd. And Jesus recognized that people were hungry. Some people were probably starving already, and other people were starting to get hungry, and it was time to eat. And so Jesus asked his disciples about that, and one of the disciples said, well, we just don't have enough. We don't have enough food, and we don't have enough money to buy the food. And Jesus said, have people sit down where they are, because there was one boy who had 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. And Jesus said, I'm going to just bless this little bit of food, and I'm going to distribute it, and it's going to be enough. And so everybody got what they wanted to eat, and Jesus, just to make the point, just to drill the point home, even though he made the point pretty clearly anyway, and the point was, see, there's enough after all. He said to his disciples, go through the crowds and collect the basketfuls of what's left over. And you know there was more left over than there was to start with? Now, some people say this is a literal miracle. The only thing that people ate were those 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. And just from that alone, there was enough for everyone. And the miracle was that Jesus took a little bit that was there and made a lot. Other people say, you know, the true miracle is that everybody had enough already. And by Jesus setting them all down, or having them all sit down and distributing what he had, it opened people's hearts, and everybody shared what they had with one another. Now, either way, however you interpret this miracle, either literally or figuratively, the point is, there is enough for everyone. So, Jesus, after this time of teaching and feeding 20, 25, 30 people, who knows, that's a lot of work. He was tired, I'm guessing. he needed his space. And that's one thing that Jesus knew about his own self, his own identity. He needed time alone. So Jesus sneaks away up into the mountains, and the disciples, after a while, think, okay, well, Jesus has been gone for a while. When we've left him before, we catch up, so we're going to go back to Capernaum. Now, Capernaum is a little town up on the very north shore of the Sea of Galilee, or the Lake of Galilee. And many scholars believe that this was actually Jesus' home after he left Nazareth. We know that he and the disciples spent a lot of time there. So in their minds, they're thinking, well, Jesus is doing his thing alone with God like he always does. He gets away and prays for sometimes days at a time. So we're going to go back home to Capernaum and wait for him there. Now, this happens to be the passage where the waves come up, the disciples are all alone, and they're getting afraid because it's nighttime and the boat's getting tossed all over the place. And they're getting very, very fearful when all of a sudden, this is where Jesus walks on the water, he just kind of steps up and tells them, don't be afraid, it is I. I'm here with you. And all of a sudden they realize they're back home in Capernaum. All of a sudden, in the meantime, the crowd that was left on the other side of the lake shore realizes, okay, Jesus is gone. His disciples are gone. We saw the boat head that direction. We know that they spent a lot of time in Capernaum, so we're going to go there. So the huge crowd went to Capernaum, and they found Jesus. And he basically said to them, I know why you're here. You want some more bread. And he reminded them of the passage that we read this morning in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, where the Israelites had left Egypt, and they're on their way to the promised land, and they're hungry, and they complain, and they're fearful because they don't think there's enough for them to survive. And so God sends all these quails, the meat for them to eat, and then God rains down bread called manna from heaven, and Jesus tells them this story once again to let them know there is enough for everyone. There is enough for everyone. And then he reminds them of who he is and who they are. He says, I am the bread of life. In other words, he's the bread from heaven. And yet, he doesn't say, I'm just for a few of you, or there's just a little bit of me, there's not enough of me to go around. He starts talking about there's enough of this bread from heaven that he is for everybody in the world. In other words, it's not just physical bread that Jesus brought people. It's the bread that feeds our souls as well, and there is more than enough of that kind of bread for everyone in the world. You see the shift in paradigm that's happening here? Rather than being a person who's living in a world of scarcity with not enough to go around, we are God's beloved, each and every one of us. And there's more than enough for all of us. I believe it's time for a new paradigm in our country. I think that we often think of ourselves as Americans, those of us who are, as poor us, there's not enough to go around. We are living in a world of scarcity, and so we celebrate primarily when the economy is doing well in our country, regardless of what's happening in the rest of the world. In fact, typically, if a politician wants to get reelected, the politician will say, hopefully, truthfully, the economy has grown while I've been in office and because of my policies. But very, very few politicians will say, vote for me because I've promoted a world of peace and justice for all. Not just Americans, but for people everywhere because we're all God's children. I think it's time for us as Americans to realize that there is enough for everyone right now. And part of who we are as those who follow Jesus, part of who we are is to share what we have, and because we know that if we're going to follow Jesus, we also are the bread of life in that sense, that we offer something to somebody that nobody else offers. We offer not only bread that's physical, that fills the stomach, we offer bread that fills our souls, that fills our hearts, that fills our very lives. A couple years ago, or a few years ago, I was reading, I think it was Newsweek magazine, and the columnist Anna Quinlan had a piece in there, and she started talking in the article, first of all, about her church in New York City, the Episcopal Church of the Holy Apostles, how they fed people every single weekday. It didn't seem like the church had enough to go around for all the people in New York City who showed up at their church, but they fed people every single weekday, Monday through Friday, regardless. Nobody left hungry. They saw themselves as bringers of the bread of life to all people. And one day there was a fire in the church, and they didn't know what they were going to do, but they fed almost 1,000 people that evening by candlelight. That's how committed they were to who they were being in the world. And there's some things that she wrote in that article that really resonated with some of my thoughts in terms of our hunger challenges as a nation and as a world. Here are just a few of her quotes. The share of the nation's income going to the top 1% of its citizens is at its highest level since 1928. The worst emergency food shortage in years is plaguing charities across the country, even while the number of those who need help grows. And in New York City, where she lives, that city receives half of the emergency food from the federal government that it once did. And the food pantry alone at the time of her writing was to come up with another 1 million pounds of food just that month. And then she wrote this: worrying about whether children could pray in school instead of whether they'd eaten before they got there is just wrong. Now, she's not against praying in school. I'm sure all of us who ever took a test has prayed in school, and I'm sure every teacher has prayed in school many, many, many times. And we know that there's no laws or rules against that. If there ever were, all I could say is good luck. But then she referred to the chapter that we read this morning, the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 people, right before what we read, actually. And she writes this: the truth is that America is so rich that political leaders could actually produce the same variant of that miracle if they had the will, and I suppose if they thought there were votes in it. Which brings us back to the question of identity. Jesus continually responded to people's questions and their needs from a place of his identity, who he was in the world. And he saw himself as a conduit of God's love. If someone was hungry, he brought them physical bread. If someone was lonely or anxious or fearful, he brought them spiritual words of comfort, spiritual bread. Jesus looked at people and saw their needs because he spent time with the people who had needs. And that's not something that people saw very often in his culture. I'm so thankful for the church, because sometimes in our culture, I think we are some of the few groups of people who see ourselves in the same way that Jesus saw himself, because he was so grounded in his identity. My friends, we must be grounded in our identity, just like Nelson Mandela was, just like Jesus was. There's a couple other quotes I wanted to read to you as I close. This is from the author and spiritual guide retreat leader and Episcopal priest Elizabeth Canham. She writes about the events in Genesis known as the fall. In other words, the first sin recorded in the Old Testament. The trouble is that Adam and Eve no longer know who or where they are. They no longer look at creation and themselves with respect and honor, but rather with a misplaced desire to have rather than to care. And she says, in a world of telecommunications, superhighways, solving the human DNA code, and travel in outer space, it's easy to forget who we are. My friends, your greatest gift to God is who you are, because you truly are a reflection of God's image. And if God is love, and you really believe that, then you are a creature of love, created in love by a creator of love. And that is the grounding that you and I need to be in this world amongst all the problems and issues and politics and everything else that we face. How can I and how can you see ourselves primarily as creatures who are created in the image of God, who are loved by God unconditionally and eternally? And how can we act and speak and think from that space?